According to countless articles, women buy 80% of fiction. The New York Times has covered this story extensively. Here's an article from 2025, one from 2024, and even one from 1997 with the exact same stat. It's odd that this crisis hasn't changed in 28 years. And where does that 80% statistic even come from? Also, if this trend has existed for so long, why is the current generation of young men being blamed for it? Let's determine whether there's any merit to this claim, and if it's baseless, why is this agenda being pushed? Before we get into the nitty-gritty, a few disclaimers. I'm going to reference a lot of charts and stats in this video. I'll try to keep things from getting too dry. If any of you data dorks would pay extra on Patreon for uncut statistical analysis, let me know in the comments below. Also, there's a problem with book selling data. It's paywalled behind expensive services. Even academic research has trouble accessing the information they need. And finally, historically there's been an imbalance in who gets published. None of this video is an attempt to oppose greater representation. For those of you wondering, Tambi is snuggled up behind me. Let's start with the New York Times article from 1997. This is the first example I could find of that 80% stat being shared. You'll notice that it doesn't even attempt to verify that. I also found it interesting how there's a fixation on a bit of a gender struggle in the publishing world. Already there was this idea that men have to cater to women. If they aren't writing strong female characters, they have no chance of getting published. To me, this passage was a bit odd. The article references a very specific survey that does not match that 80% claim. In 1994, a Gallup poll found that women made up 59% of book buyers and men 41%. For nonfiction, the breakdown was 53% women and 47% men. So in 3 years, that gap widened to 80% and then stayed stagnant for another 28 years. That doesn't make a lot of sense. The only support I found for that 80% stat in this article is one bookseller's estimation. What I like about this article is it mentions the Oprah effect on book sales. It's undeniable that women have fostered stronger communities centered around books, and that could help explain why there's a readership gap. The writer makes another great point that is still true. Despite whatever is happening in the industry, male authors are still receiving plenty of acclaim. It's also amazing that in 1997, fixation on women's love of steamy romance was also a thing. The final thing I'd like to highlight is this article mentions that upwards of 75% of the publishing world is composed of women. Given the looseness of some of the prior facts, I'd like to actually see this verified. This article from Dazed takes things a step further. No. It's not men who are a problem, it's straight men. No compelling support for this argument is provided, and I couldn't find a single study on the reading habits of gay men. LGBTQ, sure, but nothing that exclusively looked at gay men. The author instead parrots this 80% stat, citing a Guardian article that says, surveys show this. But what surveys? There's also plenty of language insinuating that the problem rests with young men who are obsessed with video games, Andrew Tate, and the manosphere. But none of that makes any sense if this book-buying divide has existed for 28 years. The men she's talking about weren't even born. That said, I do like this emphasis on the context of the Victorian era. At that time, there was a lot of female writers writing works for a female audience. So some of these trends might be cyclical. Now onto the 2024 New York Times op-ed piece by David J. Morris. David mentions that women are starting to dominate bestseller lists, and according to multiple reports, women readers now account for about 80% of fiction sales. What reports, David? What reports? Much like the Dazed article, he makes some good points about educational gaps between men and women, but then goes a bit off the deep end. He blames video games, pornography, and the manosphere again for the drop-off in male readers, specifically mentioning Andrew Tate and Joe Rogan. Now we're just in baseless claim territory. Is there any evidence to support any of this? And again, if the manosphere was the problem, why would this have been true 28 years prior? This 2025 article from the New York Times just accepts that men aren't reading. It doesn't even try to support that claim. It also contains, by now, some familiar language. As more American men fill their hours with the crude talk shows of the manosphere, online gambling, and addictive multiplayer games, the humble novel, consumed alone, requiring thought and patience, can look like a panacea. Once again, young men prioritizing things that didn't exist in 1997 are to blame. Also, the root of the argument is a bit strange. Novels aren't going to magically fix misogynistic men. I think reading's great, and I want more people to do it, but the top-selling fiction isn't conducive to changing someone's worldview. It's mostly escapism. Like with other articles, I like the context of the Victorian era. It seems like many of these novels were treated as romantasy as now, dismissed as nothing but fluff. I also like to mention how celebrity book clubs and book talk are dominated by women. Men could do a lot more in respect to community to foster reading. He also quotes a publisher from Simon & Schuster. Our competition isn't other publishers. It's social media, gaming, streaming, all these other things that are vying for people's time, attention, and financial resources. That messaging is coming from all sides, and I think if you went back to 1997, they'd be blaming television and video games. In a way, it reminds me of Satanic Panic or those bands that will totally ruin your kids' behavior. There's always some boogeyman to point at, but it's very difficult to calculate the exact influence. As you've probably gathered by now, I take exception to many of the claims in these articles. But let's get specific. While this NPR article unfortunately makes the same claim that men only buy 20% of fiction, it does bring up something very interesting. More boys than girls have read the Harry Potter series, according to its US publisher Scholastic. What's more, Harry Potter made more of an impact on boys' reading habits. 61% agreed with the statement, "I didn't read books for fun before reading Harry Potter," compared with 41% of girls. This surprised me, and maybe it shouldn't since Harry's a male protagonist, but it does show that there's a way to draw in young male readers, and I think that's a wonderful thing. Now let's get into my favorite article from Vox. I really love Constance Grady's journalistic integrity. She gets right to the point, this narrative that American men have stopped reading, and that's why things are so bad. The idea of men who need news stories but refuse to read them is also exaggerated and hyperbolic. It has become its own kind of story. It's a legend, one that's been repeated for years, haunted by zombie statistics and dubious facts. I like how she shares specific information and cites her source, a 2021 Pew Research study. 73% of men say they've read a book in the past year, compared to 78% of women. That actually seems a bit high to me. But she mentions that these stats are pretty consistent over the decade, and mentions that a differential of about 10% is not enough to warrant a crisis. She then points out that stat we kept seeing in other articles. Women account for about 80% of the fiction market, according to multiple surveys conducted in the US, Canada, and Britain, listing many of the articles that I showed earlier. Unlike with the 10-point differential, an 80% to 20% gender split is the kind of eye-popping statistic you can absolutely build a discourse around. Yet do any of these sources ever cite any of these alleged multiple surveys? They do not. She then reached out to the largest book data aggregator in the US, Circana Bookscan. But they don't even break down sales by gender. Constance then reached out to Morris, the author of the New York Times op-ed, and Taylor, who wrote the book Why Women Read Fiction. Nielsen Book Data, who operated in the UK, could not confirm an 80% divide, but shared that in 2017, UK women bought 63% of fiction, while men bought 37%. Notably, that's a big divide, but it's not 80-20. Morris was also kind enough to share some of his sources. A blog entry on the Author Guild's website, sourcing data to a now deleted blog entry by a motivational speaker. He also sent an economic study provided by the New York Times, but that didn't even have information about gender. So nothing supported that claim that women buy 80% of fiction. I'm mad about it too. A 2017 survey by the National Endowment for the Arts is also mentioned, which found that 50% of women and 33% of men had read a novel or short story in the past year. Personally, I find that much more believable than that 70% stat. Here, the mentioning that men are doing just fine in National Book Awards and Pulitzers is also important. It's not like male writers have flat out disappeared or aren't receiving any acclaim. Once again, I appreciate Constance actually providing sources. Here she points out that a 2023 survey found that 71% of publishing's workforce are cisgender women and 21% are cisgender men. The executive board level is a little more even, but still dominated by women. That makes me very suspicious of that claim in the 1997 article that 75% of the publishing workforce are women. I think that number would have gone up, not down. What's that? You want more data? Well, here we go. This 2022 Public Participation in the Arts survey was paired with the census, so I think that makes it a great representation of US demographics. Unfortunately, the trends don't look great. In 2012, 54.6% of Americans read a book within the past year. In 2017, it was 52.7%, and in 2022, 48.5%. That's not great. Notably, this study omitted book reading for school or work, and also potentially excluded audiobooks. Fortunately, the next chart covers exactly that. When you combine books and audiobooks, 51.9% of Americans read a book within the last year. This next study by Test Prep Insight was much smaller, only 1,621 participants. But oh, does it have some juicy data. The 18 to 24 and the 25 to 34 cohorts read plenty of books. It was the 45 to 54 group that was the problem. I suppose that's Gen X. Counter to what many of the earlier articles implied, I don't think young people are at the root of this problem. Of course, we should foster reading at a young age to fight some of these troubling trends, but we should take a long, hard look at salty-ass Gen X. Here's the gendered breakdown, which does show that women read more, but it's not this huge gulf. Here's a quick rundown of some of these stats. The 45 to 54 age group has the highest number of non-readers, 60.9%. The 65 plus age group reported the lowest number of non-readers, 41.4%. The 18 to 24 age group reported the highest number of audiobook listeners, 17%. Conversely, the 65 plus age group had the lowest number of audiobook listeners, at 5.3%. The types of material read also show a strange distribution. The 18 to 24 demographic reads print, ebooks, and audiobooks at a higher rate than any other demographic, with the exception of the 65 plus group reading significantly more print books. While I'm certainly not going to champion the manosphere, I don't think blaming young men for the reading gulf is necessarily fair. This article by Apex ABA Therapy breaks down the demographics further. According to Pew Research, things like ethnicity, highest level of education, and income level are all connected to likeliness to read. I can understand why the optics on blaming those demographics is far less appealing than blaming young men. This article in the Modern Mrs. Darcy makes a great point. Since women are much more likely to make purchases for the household, even if they are buying 80% of fiction, that doesn't necessarily mean that women are reading those books. Putting this information overload together, what does it all mean? For starters, that stat that women buy 80% of fiction seems like complete bull. I think it's incredibly irresponsible to keep propagating that narrative, especially when you're using it as a reason to shame young men. So why do media outlets like the New York Times keep running this flimsy story? I can only speculate. It clearly has a bit of a clickbait appeal and seems to go viral anytime they run something like this, with other outlets picking up on the story and propagating it. As the publishing industry has become increasingly consolidated and corporatized, that's led to risk aversion. So articles that emphasize how much women drive the book market can be used to justify publishing decisions while young men are being scapegoated in the process. To me, that doesn't seem like a sustainable business model, so I hope in the near future we can all come back together and enjoy reading.